Well, yeah, peace, y'all. Yeah, welcome to our first mass call of the year. Um, Last time we had a mass call, we were doing post-election analysis and discussion in the middle of November, and so we back again. My name is Akun Dayo. I'm the Director of Political Education and Culture with Black Men Build. Um, and yeah, over the last couple of months, our organization has been pretty committed to an internal study of the intellectual and political life of Walter Rodney. We see Walter Rodney, like our dear ancestor Malcolm X, as models. They are models for our organization, um, and how they're models in ways to how we think, right? How we analyze, how we struggle, how we organize, right? How we love. And so I also have my brother, my comrade Lorik, with us today. He's a Black Man Build member of our team, of our national political education team. He's also the political education chair of the Miami Hub, and we're just really excited for today. We have two guests with us that two experts on kind of the life and political life of Walter Rodney. And they just gonna cook with us today. It's gonna be great. We'll introduce them in a little bit, but in the meantime, I'll go ahead and pass to my brother Lorik to go over our values.
Peace, everyone. It's ritual to start with our values pledge, the first point of contact people have with our organization. And it's our non-exhaustive platform of beliefs. So if you rock with this, you can rock with us. But first and foremost, we are critical thinkers. We are curious about this moment. We are coming together to take an active, responsible role in freeing our communities. We are transforming to meet the moment. And we are bonded with Black women and all Black people in the fight for true freedom, with one important exception: Black people who choose to fight for the enemy or use our struggle for personal or financial benefit need not apply.
I always want to say Ashe after that. So yeah, we gonna if you've been to a mass call before, maybe throw a nine in the chat. Um, yeah, throw a nine in the chat if you've been here before. And if you've been here before, you know what comes next. And in a way, this is our ritual, kind of like a way to do our church a bit, to set up before we get discussion, right? It is a mass call. Mass call is thinking about, is meant to be, right, about the masses, our people, all of our people, and engaging with all of our people in an online format, right? Which is always limited, but this is one of the ways that we like to invite people into the space, into the online space, into the education space to share some love. And so this part of the program, uh, yeah, is called how excuse me, who do you love? And so we would love for folks to use the raise your hand function. And this is a time to, again, what is this? It's a time to be able to share publicly about who you love, right? We want to establish this conversation based in love, revolutionary love. And so we want folks to use the reaction button where you can raise your hand. We can call on folks, and you get no more than 90 seconds to share who you love. You don't have to use all that time, but that's the time we want to give it. And we're gonna take the next 10 minutes to do so. And so if you want to come off, if you want to raise your hand, we'll call on you. And you can share who you love. Um, right on. We got Wesley. Burnell Wesley, go ahead. You can talk.
Can you hear me?
You're real low. Yeah. Sorry, you're too low. I'm gonna come back to you. Uh, Cole Brown.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All
Who do
right.
you?
Well, I love my homie Lou. I've known him for probably like my friend I've known the longest time. Uh, we have a lot in common. Spend a lot of time together, and yeah, I love him very much.
Right on. Thank you. We got Asa. Who you love, brother?
The DAW.
Ace.
What's up, y'all?
What up?
Oh, dang, I put Ace of Daw. um, hey, y'all. I want to send some love to my fiance, my wonderful fiance. We're getting married on October 4th, and I am just ecstatic to, spend life with somebody that I think is going to, make that life wonderful. My son, Ivan, got an 87 on his test today
Let's go.
for math. So that made me really happy. So he got an icy after school. My daughter is calling me babe because my fiance calls me babe. But it's a word, she's learned a new word. And I want to shout out my dad. My dad is the hardest working man I know. But his life is a testament to capitalism, that you can be the hardest working person somebody knows. You could still be working check to check every day. But his love, got me through, got me where I am today, man. So shout out to my pops, Albert Carl Shaw. Love y'all. Peace.
Peace. Shout out to Albert. Shout out to the pops out here working a day hard to provide and yeah, still be under the boot. Um,
Thank you.
let me see who's next. Adrian, what's up, bro? Can you hear us, Adrian?
Hello, can y'all hear me?
There we go.
Okay. I want to give love to my sister, Alana Martin. She just beat cancer in February for the second time. She is the mother of four. She is back at work right now. She is a machine. She never, ever holds the pain on her soul. She moves forward with so much joy and so much peace in her spirit, no matter what battle comes her way. She's raising four kids by herself. She has her family support, but she's standing in her house. First battle of cancer, she lost a house. Now she got a whole nother house, two cars. And my sister is amazing. So I want to make sure I give her love every chance I get. Ashe.
I say. Yeah, I actually want to do the same. I want to show some love to my sister as well. My sister is yeah, she had a couple week stint in the hospital and she's home. And she has two lovely kids. And my sister, besides my pops and my grandmother, she's the first teacher I've had. Um, she still is that. She's still my best friend. She my ride or die. Um, yeah, before we actually, I'm gonna share some of her work. She's a phenomenal educator still and a phenomenal scholar as well. And so shout out to big sisters for sure. Who else want to show some love? We got okay, timeless.
Can y'all hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Greetings, greetings, greetings. I want to give some revolutionary love shout out to particularly all the sisters outside of the Anglophone world who have contributed to our liberation and to the revolutionary struggle globally. And I want to name Beatriz Nacimiento, who I have recently been learning about and who has introduced me to the idea that I subscribe to the teachings of modernage, and she has gone deep on the Brazilian idea of modernage, quilombos, and she teaches and writes about how quilombo is really us, the people, and our consciousness and how we move. And she introduces the idea of mojuba, an expansive memory, refusing to be housed in any single place, bound by the limits of time, enclosed within the outlines of a map, encased in the physicality of a body, or imprisoned as an exhibit in a museum. I'm going to drop that in the chat, and I just want to show some love for that sister and the many, many sisters like her, whom without we would not exist. Good
Indeed.
thanks.
Good thanks. Thank you for that offering. We have time for one more. I'm trying to get Burnell back in here.
Can you hear
Go
me?
ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Sorry. Yeah, you're still too low.
All right, don't worry about it. I wrote it into the chat.
Right on. I wrote it in the chat. See, I might want to read it out loud for you. See here. Okay. Um, I'll pass it to you, Lord. Thank y'all. Well, for that, thank y'all. Thank y'all for filling the love, filling the space with some love. Shout out to sisters. Seems to be the theme today. Whether you biological or a sister, as in reference to a black woman or woman of color or sister in the struggle. Big love to sisters today.
And before we move on, I want to share who I love, and I'm going to bring our guest on by asking them who they love as well. So I want to send love to my family, but particularly ancestors who aren't here physically but are still with me, and elders, my grandparents, uncles, aunties, the different pieces that make me whole. So I really want to send them love tonight because that's who I care about. And we're joined by some excellent guests. So y'all get ready. We're gonna have some opportunity for question and answer, and really want to tap into Ancestor Rodney. So I want to ask Musa and then Tamanisha, who do you love?
Hey, peace to everybody. This is a hard question because I love a lot of people, but I want to really shout out, I think, my dad, Carlos Springer. We had a beautiful conversation this week and healed some wounds. And then I want to shout out and give some big love to my grandmother as well. It's been 2 years without her this month, and she's on my mind heavy. And I'll pass it to my sister Tamanisha.
I'll give a shout out to my grandmother and my father who are gone, and they've been visiting me in my dreams for the past 2 weeks a lot. So I want to shout out my grandmother Lorraine and my father Everett. I also want to shout out my mom, Nichelle, as well as my brothers and sisters since I love them. So all of my family, all of my friends. Um, and I will leave it at that since I also love a lot of people.
That's why we got to come to many mass calls so you can keep sharing. There's too many people to get all in one call. We're gonna miss some shout outs. So I want to introduce our guest tonight. Musa Springer is a cultural worker, journalist, and community organizer from Georgia. They're the international youth representative for Cuba's Red Barrio Afrodescendiente, a longtime volunteer with the Walter Rodney Foundation, a member of the Black Alliance for Peace Atlanta, author of Alive and Paranoid, and host of the Groundings podcast. Tamanisha John is an assistant professor at York University in the Department of Politics and a member of both the Black Alliance for Peace and Caribbean Solidarity Network. Tamanisha is an admirer of Walter Rodney and his work and appreciates the work done in and by the Walter Rodney Foundation in Rodney's memory. And so with these guests tonight, we're really going to ground ourselves, ground with each other, and dig into the legacy of Walter Rodney. I'm going to pass it back to you, Dial.
Yeah, we're gonna start with work our way in to some more maybe complex questions, but to just start briefly, we talked about who you love. I would imagine, right? You love Walter Rodney. But could you start off by briefly just sharing your connection to our ancestor Walter Rodney, as broad or as narrow as you want to share?
Tamanisha, I'll let you start.
I'm completely fine with you starting. So something that I will say, since I'm in this space as a academic, is that I knew about Walter Rodney before I had even knew that he was a writer or an academic or anything of that sort. My family background is Guyanese, and they are Guyanese people. And not only are they Guyanese people, but a lot of them were born prior to Guyana having independence. And so because of that, I knew Walter Rodney's name before I knew who he was or any of his writings or anything. And I remember the first time that I picked up, a Walter Rodney piece of writing, it was actually a history of the Guyanese working people. And I fell in love with that book because it spoke to the landscape of Guyana itself at a time when I was, a young adult in college trying to think, why am I dealing with snow? Why did my family migrate out of Guyana and all of these things? And after reading that book, I sought out reading a lot of Walter Rodney's work since his writings and sort of the situation that he was encountering spoke to me. At that time, it was the case that not only were my family, Guyanese, but they were also immigrants in the United States, many of them without status. And as we sort of navigated different systems and processes, you sort of saw how the state came down hard on Black people, on Black immigrants. You also saw how imperialism worked to disconnect us and our communities from one another. I remember sort of the fights that seem more pronounced now between Caribbeans, Africans, and African Americans. And so Walter Rodney's work connected with me just based on location and also based on stories that I would hear from family prior to even knowing that he was someone who wrote.
Yeah, I would say for me, when I graduated high school, a family member actually gave me a copy of Groundings with my brothers. And I think at the time, 17 and too young to really like understand what it was I was reading and how important that book was. But I remember skimming through the pages and reading it and just being so interested. And then the following year, when I started college, there was a Walter Rodney class that a professor named Jesse Benjamin took. And in the Walter Rodney class, we would actually leave our campus, which was outside of Atlanta, and drive to Morehouse and take the class on the Morehouse campus with Patricia Rodney and Asha Rodney, the wife and daughter of Walter Rodney, who them in and of themselves are incredible revolutionaries who've lived wonderful, profound lives. And I revisited Groundings and I was like, I don't know if I can cuss here. Holy crap, like um, this is actually answering a lot of questions for me as it relates to why I live in this city where there's Black figures, Black politicians, Black business owners all around me, yet the Black people don't have no power. Um, and so from there, I set out to try to read everything he had written, to work and to build with the Rodney family and learn from them. And there's been no individual more profound for my intellectual, ideological, and even just the development of me as an organizer and activist. Rodney has played a role in all of those things.
I Rodney for me, and I'll just be brief. I think what Rodney is for you, Musa, was what Malcolm was for me. Um, I think the first time I actually became much more rigorous in my study of struggle was through Walter Rodney, and a comrade of mine it gave me Groundings. It's just like over a decade ago. And then was like, all right, now you need to read How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Um, and yeah, been a steady method of how I think about the work. I think about the academy and its relationship or not to the streets, to the community, to the political formations and parties. So appreciate y'all sharing that. Laura?
Yeah, and before we move forward, I forgot to set the rules of the space, so I appreciate that. We do want to keep it a little family friendly tonight. And please respect the chat. We want you to engage in the chat, but respect each other's space. It's okay to disagree, but don't be disrespectful. I'm going to move us to our next question. And it's very situated to the things you all discussed that brought you to Walter Rodney. But Groundings opens with Walter Rodney's statement on the Jamaican situation. How does Rodney's cutting-edge analysis of what we now call Neocolonialism. Help us understand the current struggles of Black people in America, the Caribbean, and throughout the diaspora, and of course, the continent.
Um, that's a great question. I think that Walter Rodney, when you think about the statement of the Jamaica situation and groundings, first you have to understand that these were not lectures he was giving like at a university behind a podium. He was going out to the gullies, to the factories, he was in the yard speaking directly with the people, the Rastas. And this is a collection of those talks essentially transcribed and put down. And so I think that context is really important just to kind of ground the whole conversation. Like that's what Rodney was really interested in doing. And, to your point about neocolonialism and the question, Rodney was doing this talk about how Jamaica now has Black leaders, but they still have no power at a time when this what we would call the Blackness leadership class or the neo-colonial class was actually like being formed. It was still a relatively new political class, which had previously been exclusively European. Then you had the introduction of, to some degree, some people of the mulatto class. And then now you had this new burgeoning, essentially development in colonialism and capitalism that what we would refer to today as neocolonialism. And so he's naming this phenomenon as it's emerging. And the same patterns are forming all across the Caribbean and Guyana, and Trinidad and other places. And so as it relates to us today, I think it's the example of how you can take a very material analysis of what's taking place around you, of the material world, the structures, who controls what power and what resources. And then you can compare that against the faces of power. So do the individuals who are being lauded as the faces of power, do they actually have access to resources, to hard power, to land, labor? And so he's essentially scorching the Jamaica situation and saying like, at the end of the day, they're still doing the bidding of the white, the white ruling class. Um, I think we can make a really direct analogy from that to today, the situation, especially here in the US. Um, and then also, I'll say too, people who are interested, there's a song called The Jamaica Situation by Protege that's influenced and based on this essay right here, the Jamaica situation. So I would definitely recommend people go and listen and check that out by Protege. And I'll pass it to you, Tamanisha.
Yes, and so I will try every time we do sort of the question, ask, and response to not sort of overlap or just be saying the sort of same things as Musa. And so something that I want to do is sort of talk a little bit about why we ground and then get more specific to the question of neocolonialism that you ask. And that is because uh, whenever we're engaged in groundings or even like this mass call or even political education, what we're trying to do is sort of come together to have some sort of purpose and build consensus at meetings where we can reason, learn, and struggle through our ideas, thoughts, and realities together while coming up with solutions that can make our community that we're grounding with better off. And so it's not a sort of learning exercise and that's it, but we're reasoning, talking, thinking through ideas to come up with solutions to make ourselves and our communities better off. And so groundings is a form of political education where you are communicating with people, given that effective communication or communicating effectively does require a community where people get to imagine the sort of solutions that we want to see to make our lives. And when I say our, it's sort of a collective, our lives better. And so it's not just talking to an audience, which is why I think it's important to point out that Rodney was going out in the streets and, talking to regular people, but it's sort of engaged in a sort of public and open type of talking exercise with people to better the situation of the community. And so because of that, groundings, just like, political education, it's a constant feedback practice that is not reactionary or stagnant. And those who initiate the groundings will typically have done some reading or have been engaged in a lot of political education sessions, so that what you are examining in these reasoning sessions is sort of what power looks like in our societies, how our communities are oppressed and for what reasons and for whose purposes. And so, groundings is an exchange of knowledge in community and also solution building in community that is not confined to the university space and actively seeks to break away from the elite in our societies in favor of the mass majority of working people. And this latter point is very important because even though Rodney, or even, myself, even though we're academics, you don't have to be an academic to initiate the groundings or to start the groundings. It is just that you have to read and have this examination of being a part of the people and distancing yourself from the elite that oppresses the mass majority of you. And some people don't like to hear that you have to read or that you have to engage in political education. But something that Horace Campbell likes to say that I really appreciate and take to heart is, and I'm directly quoting him here. He says, "No right to study, no right to speak." And he said that that was something that they actively stressed in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, because if you're not reading, if you're not engaged in a political education, then that means that you are effectively unable to guard yourself and anyone else in your community against propaganda put out by the state. And so why we engage in groundings is very important. And so now that I've said that, on this question of neocolonialism, I think that it's very important how Rodney, in groundings and in the lectures that he was giving, distinguished between the theoretical display of being racialized as someone that is Black, and then using that to accommodate white supremacy, to accommodate imperialism, and to accommodate this idea, like this elitist idea of making it to the detriment of the majority. And he puts that theoretical display of, using your Blackness for white supremacy or neocolonial goals against what he sees as the conscious political goals of Blackness and Black people, which was to be anti-imperialist, to rebel so that you can assume power and partake in revolutionary struggle, and to also then, in that process, reconstruct your community and your societies in a way that embodies freedom for all of the oppressed. And so for Rodney, Black people, or to say that you were someone who was Black, you needed to encompass those political goals or those, of what it means to be Black, and then also fighting for Black freedom. And so once you get to those three goals, then I think that the modern day saying that people have is essentially, when I'm talking about this theoretical display, is not all skin folk are kinfolk. And then what is a freedom fighter is someone fighting for Black people to be free. And so what he was talking about is even people within the same racialized groups can be antithetical to the freedom and liberation of said racialized group. And when I think about the Jamaica statement, and I, quickly skimmed it yesterday to come and talk here, I realized that the civil rights movement in the United States and the Black Power movements in North America, and just that spread throughout the world, and also the anti-apartheid struggles, were all global, internationalist, and Pan-African struggles that brought peoples racialized as Black together. And it made us cognizant of those political goals to fight against imperialism, to try to assume power, and all of these things that sort of get forgotten or misremembered today, given that there is this co-optation that goes on. So I'll wait until the co-optation question, I guess, to talk more about that, and seeing how solidarity breaking and sort of the removal of grounding spaces that happen for us contributes to that.
Right on. Man, I have so much to say. We got to figure out. Anyway, Lord, is there anything you wanted to respond to, or should I go to the next question?
No, they broke it down and we got some things to get into. So appreciate that explanation of grounding, and let's move it.
Yeah, yeah. So pivot but never really pivot when we talking about Walter Rodney. It's always connected. So, the way our people experience culture, particularly in the US, right? A lot of it is through popular means. Popular in the sense of popular cultural production, right? Music, film, art, print media, etc. Um, but we know that culture is not just production. And art, in many ways, is a way to understand. But people kind of conflate culture with just art in some kind of way. And so, I want to pull Rodney's definition in here, right? Rodney defines culture as a total way of life. It embraces what people ate, what they wore, the way they walked, and the way they talked, the manner in which they treated death and greeted the newborn. End quote. Uh, Rodney also tasked us, right, with revolutionizing our culture. So, how do we take on this challenge today?
I think this is a great question because so many people focus on Rodney as the historian, Rodney as the political theorist, and they kind of forget that he lays us a roadmap in his work to think through culture as a revolutionary weapon, essentially. Um, so if we think about him stating a culture is a total way of life, for him, culture is not separate from our labor, from the work that we do, from the manner in which we organize that work. It's not separate from how we relate to one another, such as like our families, our partners, our girlfriends or boyfriends or whoever. Um, all of these things come into a definition of culture when we're looking at it from a Rodneyist lens, because we understand culture doesn't spring from nowhere, right? Culture does not just come from thin air. Culture has to come from some kind of basis. And so, if the basis of culture is struggle for liberation, for freedom, for justice, struggle on behalf of African peoples at home, abroad, and everywhere, then of course that culture and the cultural artifacts and products that that produces is going to reflect that, it's going to mirror that, and it's going to advance those objectives. But if we compare and contrast that to the kind of bourgeois capitalist culture that you were mentioning when asking the question, I like to give the example of like the BET Awards. Could we call that, they call it culture's biggest night, the biggest night in culture. That's their tagline. But whose culture does that represent, right? And what is the basis of that culture that is perhaps being represented at the BET Awards? It's corporations, it's consumption, it's things that certainly strip us further away from the goals of liberation of African people and the unification of Africa under scientific socialism, certainly. And so I think when we think of culture, we have to first redefine or rethink of how we conceptualize and think about it at all, right? Culture is not just a painting, it's not just a song, it's not the movie Sinners, which maybe you should go see, who knows. Um, those are the products and the artifacts of a culture. Those are what come out of a culture. But culture itself is how we're relating to one another. Um, and I think that's what is most important. And so when we're talking about redefining and recreating a new kind of culture, we have to be talking about how we're relating to each other. So even the way that we opened up this mass meeting with talking about who we love, and you don't do that in a lot of other spaces, right? That is sort of the process of changing culturally how we relate to one another, how we communicate to one another, the values and principles that we're publicly communicating. This is what is in culture. Even in Rodney's other book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, he's talking about various African societies 600 years ago, but he's talking about how what they did on a day-to-day basis built their culture. So if their spiritual practice looked a certain way, that would dictate how they related to all of the women in the village. Or that would, if this was a village in which they mainly ate fish and it was very big on fishing, then their cultural practice related to that, right? And not to get too abstract or historical, but we have to think about for today, how are we relating to one another and how are we expressing that relation in our culture? And it isn't just a music video, it isn't a Cowboy Carter tour. Those things, I would argue, are the absence of culture in many ways. But culture is about how we're relating to each other and how we're kind of re-identifying ourselves through those relationships. And I think we practiced it tonight on this mass call, opening up with giving love. But I'll yield there.
And I'll be short this time since I gave a long answer, but I just remember as you were asking the question and I was like trying to write it down, the two things that I wrote is self-realization and expression. And then I also wrote keeping historical legacy intact and preserving it. And I think that those are very important because when you see something like the BET Awards or Cowboy Carter tour, I think that Rodney would point out those being theoretical displays of Blackness. So theoretically, this is something you should like, and it's showcasing these Black people doing this Black stuff, but it's doing so in a way that sorts of supports the white supremacist system, doesn't speak to the condition of Black people, how we're relating to each other, how it matters for our history. And so that would be the sort of theoretical display Rodney warns against when he's analyzing what neocolonialism is. And when we think about culture, as this total way of life, it's sort of looking at how we relate to each other. And to relate to each other, you have to, again, be pursuing those three political goals of what it means to be a Black person. And to do that, there needs to be some self-realization on behalf of you knowing what your position and your community's position is in the society, how it's related or distanced from power, all of those types of questions. And then in preserving historical legacy, just making sure that nothing is lost along the way so that we're not repeating something. Funnily enough, I was talking to two of my best friends a few days ago. One is Jamaican, one is Trinidadian. And we're always lamenting, but we were lamenting this time about the fact that when we read older radical Caribbean people, they had all of this interregional dialogue in the Caribbean that was occurring, and how today the type of interregional dialogue that we read about seems harder to have just because the price of traveling between countries is so expensive, or just because there's not these sort of print journals or even online websites that connects all of our struggles together. And now we're talking about this in the context of the past 5 years, seeing so many labor protests in the Caribbean, but no central place to tell you these protests are happening on the French islands, the Dutch islands, the English islands, the Spanish islands, but how that wouldn't have been the case, a couple decades ago. And part of that is intentional because it is that sort of breaking down and intentional misremembering of historical legacies that aid white supremacist separation and sorts of denounces regional integration. And we were also talking about how CARICOM itself as an entity not addressing a lot of these pressing questions we wanted to address today is because CARICOM was the sort of anti-communist, anti-Black radical anti-West Indian Federation compromise. And so it was not set up to address these pressing questions that matter to us today. And so again, I'll leave it there, but I would say he's talking about the totality of relations, self-realization and expression, and also keeping or preserving our historical legacies so that it's not lost, co-opted, misremembered.
And if I could just also add one quick thing on top of that too, because every time Tamanisha speaks, it's just straight fire. Like, just got to give props for that. But also, like to your point, Tamanisha, and talking about reclaiming culture and fighting off things like co-optation and the fragmentation of how our cultures are communicated or not communicated. Also, like commodification. Like colonialism and capitalism have dictated to us that our culture as Africans is only valuable to the extent that it can be commodified, right? When you actually think about what an actual cultural practice are, it's usually things that are not commodified at all. It's things that take place in your neighborhood, in your churches or mosques, in your homes, at school, amongst friend groups, right? These are actually the relations of culture that extend borders, that extend throughout the diaspora, that we find like we're doing the same dance over here that these people are doing. And it's things that are typically not commodified at all, right? But we've been so brainwashed and indoctrinated through white supremacist capitalism and imperialism that we feel like the extent of our culture's value is only as far insofar as it can be commodified. And I think Rodney would certainly disagree with that for sure. But I wanted to just add that on top as well.
Indeed. Thank you for that. Yeah, I'm deeply interested in the conversation around culture I think, right, there's many people we can bring into the conversation, right? Cabral, right? Thinking about resistance, powerful tool, culture as a powerful tool of resistance against foreign domination. Um, yeah, Fanon enters the conversation in quite a few ways, and on and on and on. Um, yeah, I'll pass to Lord for our next question.
And I appreciate y'all's build there, especially the commodification, preservation. I was going to say in defense of the BET Awards, crazy way to start a sentence, but brother at our men's circle always tells me our enemy studies us. And we want to authentically express, because I remember defending the BT Awards. I used to laugh. Y'all watching the Grammys? I'm watching the BT Awards with my family at the barbecue. And it would be to honor, the fact that we live in a white supremacist society. And Mary J. Blige should have had 10 Grammys. Give her more. And New Edition fathered all the boy bands. So that kind of thing. But it is polluted. So, and that moves us into this question about how we get power and protect ourselves from these attacks. So, Rodney defines Black Power as a revolutionary, working class, anti-colonial movement, which y'all touched on earlier, and then presents a bold socialist Pan-Africanist vision. One of his tactics in presenting that vision was his work as a scholar and educator. Rodney stressed the importance of learning African history and using it in service of the Black masses. Our power and our education has taken on a new wave of repression today. With that, how should we understand Black power today, and how do we combat today's attacks? I'm in Florida, so you already know. Book bans, anti-DEI laws, ADOS debates about our identity, on African history, and attacks on our collective political power.
I'll go first. I think first off, the question of defining Black power for today is relevant with a touch of irony, because what Rodney was doing in Groundings with the definition you reference is he was defining what Black power meant for the Caribbean at a time when it was a largely North American, US sort of framework and concept that was exploding, right? And so I think our task today is to understand. People mentioned Cabral, Amilcar Cabral earlier, African revolutionary Cabral, that our conditions are dynamic and they're in movement at all times. And if we can understand what Black power meant in the 60s or 70s, even 80s or 90s, then that means that the conditions that would define something like Black power would be changing today as well. So we can't have a static definition. I think when we use terms like Pan-Africanist, right, that's a very large part of any expression of Black power. When we talk about Pan-Africanism, or at least when I'm speaking of it, and the definition that is very closely aligned with Walter Rodney as well, it's the total liberation and unification of Africa under scientific socialism, which would inevitably include support and liberation for the African diaspora as well. So I always do think it's important to just ground us in what we mean when we use these terms. And Black power was deeply, deeply influenced by the anti-colonial movements taking place around the world, not even exclusively to the African world, but movements like the Vietnam War for liberation against the US imperialists, right? You had uprisings taking place in, Burkina Faso, the Congo, Ghana, et cetera, et cetera. And so Black power to me is necessarily internationalist. It's necessarily socialist. It's necessarily Pan-Africanist. And if I were to look at our conditions today, the things that you describe, right? Anti-DEI, book bans, ADOS and FBA debates around our identity, abortion bans, which in the South primarily target and harm Black women and Black people. I would suggest that those same things, socialism, Pan-Africanism, internationalism, are actually what's needed to remedy many of the issues and ills of today as well, right? So looking at these conditions, I would say we need to be dialectical, which just simply means understanding that the material conditions are not stagnant, are not static, right? But they're constantly evolving, and so too does our idea of Black power. In a world dominated by imperialism, where the US can have, for example, AFRICOM, the US African Command, which for 53 out of the 54 African nations, the US partners, right, partners with those militaries, aka occupies, and exerts force across the African continent. In a world in which there can have over 850 US military bases globally, if our politics today and our understanding of Black power today is not internationalist and Pan-Africanist, then it's a dead-end approach, I would say. And then lastly, it relates back to the very first question you asked around neocolonialism and the band-aids I'll say that we're given for the gunshot wounds that we receive. You know, things like DEI, book bans, these are DEI, for example, is a concession in and of itself. It's the ability to fast track the assimilation of a small handful of Africans into a, as Walter Rodney would say, quote, milky white imperialist power structure. And so when we get caught up in these battles, right, these battles around book bans, whereas of course I don't support book bans, but half the books being banned politically not the best, right? We get caught up in these struggles. We're actually taken away and distracted to an extent from the actual true objectives of what a Black Power movement today would, could, and should look like. So I'll leave it there and pass it to my sister.
Yes. And I like have so many things in my mind that I want to say, but one thing I do want to say before I start is I want to repeat what I said was one of my favorite things that I always remember Horace Campbell saying, which is no right to study, no right to speak. And when he is saying that, studying is not only studying the past, but you also have to study and talk about what's happening right now. We have to recognize that time has moved on, and as time has moved on, strategies of a couple decades ago are co-opted and misplaced. And so our strategies have to be evolved in some respect to meet the time. And we can look to struggles that historically helped to end apartheid or even end direct occupations and how they are not working to the same extent today. You can look to Palestine and you can also look to Haiti. And so us talking, being community, is that we have to have an imagination that addresses the times and the co-optation that has gone on. And so that is why we study. And, you know, study occurs even in the context of book bans. And this is why I also said study can happen in sort of political education and grounding sessions. It's not only about reading the books, because at the height of Caribbean radicalism, in the English-speaking Caribbean, Marx and a lot of these socialist texts were banned. They were not allowed to be imported in these countries, but people still developed their radical Caribbean politics by grounding with each other, being in political education, learning from each other, learning from someone that had learned from abroad and came back. And so that's very important to stress. Even without the books, you can still analyze the material situations and realities that confront you. And now when we talk about sort of Walter Rodney and Black Power, especially in the sort of collection of groundings that he was speaking about, that it was for the Caribbean context is very important because Rodney and Groundings define Blackness as political and as a consciousness that was not separated from material analysis. And so when Rodney is talking about Blackness or Black people, he's even grouping in non-white people into that sort of definition. And yes, he did point out that people of African descent had a distinct position that was clearly distinct from, you know, the other non-white groups. But his main point was to build solidarity. And to build solidarity, he said Blackness as a political consciousness had those three political goals. And I will say them again, but it was that you had to break with imperialism. And so Black people had to be anti-imperialist because it was a white racist system. And you also had to have power assumed by the Black masses that make up the majority of the world. And within the sort of anti-colonial context, this wasn't confined to the Caribbean, but it was also in Africa, Asia, all of these other places. And then we had to reconstruct our societies and communities in ways that were anti-imperialist and allowed the Black masses to sort of assume power in our image. And so within all three of those political goals that he outlined for what it meant to be, Black and not within the sort of neo-colonial white supremacist understanding of theoretical Blackness, you had a global rebellion against the status quo that would help push revolution or actual change that was liberatory and free. And so I will say this for people on the call who don't know, but Rodney was unapologetically a Marxist. Rodney unapologetically stressed scientific socialism. He was not someone who shied away from words like Marx, socialism, or communism. So if you have a Black person talking about liberation, but shies away from those terms, you need to find other people to ground with, or you need to bring the sense into that grounding space so that it can evolve to be more liberatory. And so, because he was talking about all non-white peoples and sort of that understanding, Rodney's designation of these theoretical displays of Blackness in Jamaica allowed him to point out Black people, again, pursuing the goals of the white supremacist imperialist system as sort of white-hearted. And so it's not enough to simply be racialized as Black, but to be Black, one had to consciously be aware of the fact that they were fighting for global Black emancipation. And when you understand Black people and Blackness in that way, then Rodney is stressing the classic, belief that the strongest unity is unity in struggle, and also that there's always opportunity in struggle. And so no one who is actively pursuing the goals of anti-imperialism and revolution could be excluded from struggle. And when we talk about what that means for today, I think that today too much time is spent on the theoretical displays of Blackness and how we are racialized, and it has been to our detriment as it pushes the conversation that we should be having away from our political goals, not just within communities that are racialized as Black, but also in other racialized communities that are non-white. And so in one of our grounding sessions that we had with Forrest Campbell, he said something else that I found profound. And I keep mentioning Horace Campbell, but love him, his work, his analysis, because it is contemporary. It moves with the time. But he said something to address someone who did not like the fact that our Caribbean Community Studies Circle was multiracial in Toronto, that we ground in a multiracial setting. And what he said, I think that we should really take to heart. He said, "I am human and nothing human is foreign to me. White supremacy, imperialism, and capitalism made me Black. And so I use my Blackness as a political tool to fight against white supremacy, capitalism, and imperialism, not to imprison me in my Blackness and not to hinder me from building solidarity." And this point on solidarity is very important, and it sorts of expresses what Rodney was expressing, because the work of liberation requires a lot of people. And all of us, Black people, should always be encouraged to examine our circumstances, because we need new and innovative ideas globally that are just as dynamic as the various ways that the ruling classes come to co-opt and destroy our political consciousness and veers us off the track from what the political goals of Black people are. Walter Rodney was assassinated, so unfortunately, we don't have his thoughts on our current situation available to us. Nonetheless, I believe that the political goals of Blackness and Black people have not changed. And, people have rightly critiqued that Rodney shouldn't have homogenized all non-white people into this category of Black people to push ethno-racial solidarities. And that's fine, because today, again, because times have moved on, we can call people allies or comrades or partners in struggles, and that is fine. But the pressing question when we think about Black power today, or solidarity building today, or co-optation, to me, is how do we articulate our political goals in a way that is solidarity building without essentializing these theoretical questions of race that then become the basis for destroying unity and solidarity, even amongst Black people. So again, the African Americans versus Caribbean versus continental Africans, and then even within the societies, the separation is broken down by, oh, my parents were here for this many generations versus yours. That is a reactionary and solidarity breaking type of discourse. And it's sad because you have all of these advances in technology, but as I pointed out, it hasn't increased the actual political dialogue between us. And we have to realize that these breakdowns are a part of the sort of white supremacy and white supremacist institutions and systems that co-opt to distract us away from our political goals. So when you think about things like ADOS or FBA, those are compromises that excuse colonialism, imperialism, and white supremacy for some, but not for others. And I think it's important to bring that into the conversation about neocolonialism as well, because we see neocolonialism as this sort of informal colonial rule, policies, laws, and norms that are carried out by skin folk that adhere to capitalist white supremacist extraction. But it also speaks to a type of misremembering that gives Black people false solutions that are pushed by these white supremacist capitalist class. So, for instance, and I'll try to make this point very succinct and then end here since I've been talking for a while, but if Black wealth largely disappears within 2 generations, meaning that if you, for some reason, are able to become a millionaire, but 2 generations later, your family are going to be poor and dispossessed again, then it at once points out that Black capitalism is nothing free. It doesn't give liberation or any of that. But also it points out that talking about reparations along exclusivist and nationalist lines and sentiments only offers a minor redress in a system where Black people are not meant to succeed at all. Reparations includes overthrowing the capitalism. Reparation includes migration so that Black people are not cut off from dialogue with each other. Reparations must be global because the system that oppresses us is global. And when you narrowly confine it in these, reactionary conversations, which ultimately takes away our human dignity, and you have people begging for specific crumbs from a state, again, it is not granting freedom. And this is very important because Rodney in Groundings is speaking about the wider political economy and imperialistic aspects in countries that are predominantly Black, that were granted formal independence, but again, who the mass majority of people are still eviscerated. And not only is that the case for them in that country, but that is the condition of other people like them globally. And so I just think that how we think about these things have to move on, because talking about how things were in the past aren't going to address that contradiction that is staring us in the face in the present.
You laid that out. That was fantastic. Um, this is great. We are already running out of time, which is fine because we've made a lot of great points here. So I'm going to open it up for question and answer period. And we have some questions in the chat that I'm going to read. Appreciate you laying all this out. You're laying so many
Yeah.
memories kind of loose for me. You talked about it, elders. I said I love my ancestor, but my uncle in Miami, as I pull up these questions, he was the mayor of a neighborhood in Miami, a historically Black neighborhood, Opalaka. And when Nelson Mandela came to Miami, he was supposed to get the key to the city, but because he's a Pan-Africanist and was aligned with Castro and the Cuban Revolution, the anti-communist, milky white imperialists in Miami no longer presented the key to the city to Mandela. But my uncle, who was not a revolutionary, great man, not a revolutionary by any means, but this thing about Black power, was able to give a key to the city to Mandela. So Mandela has a key to Black Miami, but he doesn't have a key to Miami in general. I think that's pretty relevant. I'm going to jump us into our first question. It's hard to ignore Rodney's travels. He taught in Tanzania. He famously was exiled from Jamaica with the Rodney riots named in his honor. He frequently traveled. What's the importance of travel and internationalism today? What should we learn from Rodney? How might we resurrect the cross-national dialogue that Dr. Tamanisha referenced?
Tamanisha, you want to take that one?
Um, so this is something that uh is very important to me, mostly because I find that as a Caribbeanist, sometimes our countries and the people within them aren't talking as much due to different language barriers. And not only that, but language exchange programs are also painted nefariously by US state propaganda that then sometimes gets picked up by governments. So, for instance, a year or two ago, Venezuela, since they had a few Venezuelans leaving Venezuela and going to different Caribbean countries, started doing this, what I think is a good thing, it should be encouraged, program where they would develop free Spanish language schools in different Caribbean countries so that if you're a Caribbean person and you didn't speak Spanish, you could go and learn Spanish at those schools so that you could interact not only with Venezuelans coming into your country, but to me also with other countries in your region that speak Spanish. However, uh, the programs by Venezuela were heavily demonized and painted by the United States as Venezuela trying to take control over of certain countries. And that was sort of the narratives that were being pushed by governments almost tacitly so that people would accept those narratives. And again, the imperialists are always trying to make it so that we are not communicating with each other, right? And so we have to break that down. And because they don't want us to break that down, they've also made the cost of traveling so that this communication can happen a lot more expensive than it needs to be. So I always tell people I speak 3.5 languages. I speak English, I could speak my Guyanese patois, and I can get around in a Spanish country by myself, right? But my grandmother, before she passed, I didn't know she spoke six or seven languages just because she was not someone who was, university educated or well educated. I had a friend come over one time for spring break and they were talking to someone on the phone and my grandmother could understand them and that shocked me because she had never told me, oh, I speak, these languages. And it just saddened me because she was saying like, oh, back in those days, you used to could go to the other countries and places and figure out what people were doing to fix their situation back there. Or, oh, when the Cuban doctors came here, they would teach us Spanish, and that was something that was encouraged so that we wouldn't view them as randomly coming in speaking this weird language. And so travel still remains something that is very important, especially because you don't want it so that it is the imperialists that are doing the translations for you. You need people to be saying, no, these language schools are a good thing, not just because we get to now communicate more effectively with people that exist in our community, but also because it encourages a sort of regionalism where you don't have the US as any sort of middleman between how you are seeing your neighbors. And so I think that that is very important.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, Tamanisha. And I can be brief. A light bulb clicked for me many years ago when I read a book called Forging Diaspora, and it spoke about Langston Hughes. And Langston Hughes spent a lot of time traveling between Harlem and Havana, Cuba. And he formed a politic where he believed that people of African descent globally actually had a right to travel because we had been historically denied our right to movement and our right to travel. And Langston Hughes believed that we had been denied our connections with our African siblings globally due to colonialism and slavery. And I mean, we think of Langston as a poet. We don't ever talk about him as a very card-carrying communist member. Um, so, I think that that is still relevant. And I also don't want to contain this to international travel. I mean, there's people who live in Atlanta who've never been to Mississippi. There's people in Mississippi who've never been to New York, people in New York who've never been to the West Coast, right? Um, we live in one of the largest countries on earth here in the belly of the beast, and our own culture and cultural practices here domestically are wide and varied, as are our practices of struggle. The way they're struggling at Cooperation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, is way different than how BAP New York is struggling up in New York, or et cetera, right? Um, and so I think that that's one thing is like, we've been historically denied the right to travel. We've been denied the means and the resources to travel. It can often, like Tamanisha said, be extremely expensive. But when you do have the opportunities, especially if you're part of a political organization and you get the chance to go on a delegation. Like, for example, every year there's a May Day brigade that goes to Cuba in May. There's a Vince Ramos Brigade, which is led by some dope Black women and queer folks. There's several delegations that go all around the world if you're tapped in, if you're with political organizations. It's a way for you to go and perhaps fundraise for those funds to get there and then to see the country or the place from a political lens, from a grassroots lens. Um, and then lastly, the last thing I'll say is sometimes you do not realize how messed up the US is until you get outside the US. Um, I've traveled places and even just hearing the perception that other Africans elsewhere have of the US, right? Like I was in Mexico grounded with some Afro-Mexicans and they were like, how many guns do you own? You know, like does everyone around you have 5 guns or 10? And they were being dead serious, you know, but or the fact that in my neighborhood where I live currently, the sidewalk stops. Like it just stops. There's just no sidewalk at some point. We don't have a metro system. We have no social services whatsoever. But you can travel to a so-called poor or third world, quote unquote, country in the Caribbean and Latin America or elsewhere and see Africans living a much higher quality of life than you have in the belly of the beast. And so, for your political development, for your internationalism, it requires you to step outside of your home and your neighborhood through books, through movies and films and documentary, and if you're able, through travel as well.
And I said this already, but I just want to repeat, but migrations and going off of what Musa said, movement itself is reparations because there are so many people who don't even travel within the United States. Prior to me going and living in the US South, you'd hear all of these stereotypes in New York about the US South. And when I went there, I was like, there's more Black people here than in New York, right? And so again, it gets rid of sort of the ignorance and also allows you to be in conversation with different communities.
Excellent. I'm going to get us into two quick ones that are theory related to knock these out. And someone in the chat asked, Pan-Africanist, are we going to have a Pan-Africanist that's not from the US? Yeah, check out our last Theory Thursday. Brother Amawale is from Guyana. The next question, how would you all define scientific socialism?
I'll take a stab at this one. Yes, and just a reminder, Sister Tamanisha is from Guyana, by the way. But scientific socialism, to put it in basic terms, is equitable distribution of the means of production and the benefits reaped from that production. So what that means is you have a state apparatus where the workers, those who are laboring, are in control of dictating how resources are used, how resources are distributed. And it's the opposite, I would say, of what we currently have, which is where a small handful of capitalists control and dictate labor, factories, raw materials, land, and the small group, determines what happens with the resources that are generated from our labor. It's flipping that on its head and saying the masses of workers who actually generate the capital through their labor get to determine what society looks like, how it's shaped like. Socialism is something that is context dependent. What scientific socialism looks like in Cuba is not the same thing as what it may look like in Burkina Faso or what it may look like in Soviet Russia 40, 50 years ago, or what it looks like in China, et cetera, right? It's context dependent. And so, scientific socialism is the process of developing a socialist state, essentially. So I was trying to, not get too big and abstract there. I don't know if you want to correct me or add anything, Tamanisha.
I was just going to ask about that scientific part, Tamanisha, if you could get into that. And yeah, you were the other person I thought of as a Pan-Africanist, not from the US. So
So when we posit that something is a science, all we are putting forward is the fact that uh, specific rules exist, and based on the environment and where you enact those rules, uh, you can get different outcomes. I think that oftentimes when people hear the word scientific, they think that it means something that's big and scary. But all scientific is really saying is that if you live in a society where, I don't know, people make $100 an hour, or people are not making any money an hour, they, grow their own food and all of these things, is that society then, uh, if you change something minor about that society, like who's doing the farming here or who's making the $100 here, what is that going to look like? And whatever it turns out looking like, is it going to be helpful for the majority of the people in that place? So if you're in an agrarian society where every single person is a farmer, but some people are able to eat more than others because some people have more fertile land, is there a way to make it so that more people get to eat, essentially, so that it's going to be beneficial for the whole of society, of everyone living there, because you don't want some people going hungry and others not? Or if you're living in a society where people are earning $100 an hour, but the cost of living in that society requires them to earn 1,000, how is it that the cost of living can be so high, but people there are earning so low? And I know that I'm using extremist examples, but there is a reason for that. And the reason for that is because when we talk about socialism itself, a lot of people, again, they view socialism as this scary term given propaganda. But all it is pointing out is not this sort of homogenizing or sameness of everyone's situation in society. What it's saying is that if you change different components of people who live within that particular society, are you guaranteeing the best outcomes for all of those people? And so when, I talk to socialism about with my students and what that means by the workers owning the means of production, I typically say if you own a business, your business is going to have operational costs. Your business is also going to be bringing in a certain amount of revenue, and there's going to be a certain number of people who work in that business. So let's say that your operational cost in your business is $100, but your business brings in $20,000 a year, and you have, 5 employees that are each making $100 a month. Because of how stark those differences is, you know that their labor, or how much they're generating in their labor, is being stolen somewhere. And that is the capitalist, or the owner of the business, pocketing all of those extra earnings. And what we're saying is that that middleman exists, but doesn't need to exist. Workers can work and live in societies where they pay their own operational costs because they know what it takes for their society to run. And then they get to bring home to share equitably in whatever it is that their labor produces. People like to boogeyman that, to say, oh, the McDonald's worker is going to be making the same amount of money as the doctor. And that is just not true, which is why the struggle, even in socialism, never ends. The struggle always continues, since you're always trying to reach a stage where the maximum and most efficient amount of distribution and well-being for everyone in that society exists. And so I think that it's very important that we don't try to view it as very abstract, especially because if we break it down in such a simple way, you know that if you worked for me and I made $100 and my operation costs were $2 and I'm only giving you $4, you know that you've been ripped off. But what happens is that we live in a society where we tell everyone, no, you can all be a capitalist. And that is just not true. If everyone were capitalists, then there would be no people left to exploit. Capitalism as a system depends on your exploitation, and not just on your exploitation, but the exploitation of a mass majority of people. And I want to bring in this other example, for instance. In the Caribbean, we import a lot of products from the United States, Canada, and Europe, right? So what does that mean for then people who live in the Caribbean? There was something that I saw in Jamaica, and I always bring it up since it pisses me off. But when I was in Jamaica, you had two boys, and when I say boys, they were probably in like their 20s or 30s. But you had two boys, And they had this hammer and they were hitting this road and back-breaking labor to break this road. And right next to them was a Caterpillar machine. And so I went downstairs and I asked them, why are y'all hurting y'all backs to break this road instead of using this machine? And they said, the boss bought that machine, but none of us knows how to use it. But the fact that that machine exists then justifies that the boss only needs to hire 2 people. And now you have this massive technology that the boss gets to save more money on, because he's not hiring enough people to break the road, and none of them can break the road. And now 2 underpaid people are physically hurting their body to make a wage from breaking that road. You are being ripped off. And so I think that people need to stop viewing socialism as a sort of dirty word. And if I'm remembering correctly, Walter Rodney has a piece where he talks extensively about what scientific socialism is, and he explains those dynamics. And we have to be honest with ourselves and say, why are we being sold this dream of capitalism as something good when that means that we would then be consenting to the mass exploitation of the most amount of people versus better distribution and engagement of goods for the, most amount of people, right?
Absolutely. I'm gonna give us a time check because we got about 6 minutes left. So I want to get this next question and then make it pretty brief. And for study, if folks are interested, the essay was Marxism and African Liberation.
Yeah.
So definitely check that out. And there's also, not Marx, but Engels, his boy, wrote Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. And it's about actually existing socialism, how you can't just imagine it like a utopia, because the imperialists, them crackers, will destroy it. And so what does it look like to build it in the real world? And y'all really got at that with the process. So this next question is a little more about academia, and then we'll probably close with something about groundings. Decolonial Marxism, the book attributed to Walter Rodney, was labeled as such by publishers, Verso, I believe, despite the fact that Rodney did not and does not use the term/concept in any of his writing. How do y'all think Rodney would analyze the decolonial trend in academia today?
So I'll let Musa talk since we're currently in the process of editing that or fixing that or correcting that, especially because Rodney's own essays in that decolonial Marxism book debunks the title itself. And so I'll let you go first, and then I'll.
That's wild. Tamanisha said, I'm gonna let you get messy, Musa. Um, I would suggest folks, there's a podcast episode with myself and the good sister comrade Sharice Burton Stelly on the Upstream podcast, where we answer this question in length, in depth, because they had many questions for us about this. I would say one, so Rodney viewed decolonization as extremely important. He viewed decolonization, he explicitly in some of his writings cites thinkers like Frantz Fanon, who was an incredible African revolutionary who wrote pretty extensively about decolonization as an act of undoing the colonial world through extremely organized material means. I'll put it like that. And so Rodney is a very big fan of the concept of decolonization and sees it as a necessary step towards socialism. However, the term decolonial and the academic practice of decolonial and this trend, I don't know if it's trend, I don't want to be disrespectful, but this field or category of scholarship literally did not exist when Rodney was alive and writing. Rodney never used that term to describe himself or others. Rodney would speak specifically about decolonization in the African context when referring to specific struggles or historical phenomena that took place or certain objectives to be achieved. But he didn't view his work as academic decolonial theory. And so, as Tamanisha said, when you actually read decolonial Marxism, and he kind of rejects that framework in and of itself. Walter Rodney was a Marxist. I would describe him as being very close to like a Marxist-Leninist if we're getting extremely specific. But of course, him being an African from the Caribbean, he stretches what we think of in terms of Marxism or orthodox or traditional Marxism, right? He's a third world Marxist. And if you know anything about the history of Marxism, everywhere that it has actually taken place and caused revolutionary change, for the most part, has been the people of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And so we don't need to describe that and create a new term for that and merge decolonial and Marxism together. That in and of itself is the essence of Marxism, right? As both me and Tamanisha said earlier, socialism, scientific socialism looks differently where it is applied and where it takes place. So if we're going through a process of struggling towards socialism in a colonized or neo-colonized society, then of course decolonization will be a necessary step towards that path for socialism. And so I would say the decision for that title is somewhat on the publisher, somewhat on the original academic behind putting that together. Um, and we can still understand these issues. I see Sister Erica in the comment in the chat being messy. We can still understand the issues and contradictions with such a title and the framing without disregarding the work itself. Like if you just kind of disregard that, that book is straight fire. There's a lot of issues with the book because, for example, people don't realize like those are a variety of different kinds of writings. Some of them are speeches, some of them were written for like newspaper articles or papers or given at a conference. And the book provides none of that context whatsoever. It just slaps it all under this label, decolonial Marxism, bada bing, bada boom. And so there's a lot of issues with that. Um, I'm gonna yield there because I was about to say something, but I'm gonna
Yeah,
have.
we are almost out of time. So I'm going to ask Tamanisha to close that question, perhaps with, so y'all, just to summarize y'all's issues with the modifier, decolonial, perhaps like the way people modify racial capitalism, saying that the adjective is unnecessary because the descriptor itself works, right? Okay. And then Tamanisha, well, you can add to that to close us out. And what would you call the book then? Would be my question instead of decolonial Marxism. How would y'all title it?
So one thing I will say is that decolonial Marxism presumes that Marxism is colonial and must go through a decolonization process, which were qualifiers that Rodney actually warned against, precisely because when you put those qualifiers, then you get and you allow for the myth to be spread that Marx was Eurocentric, which is just false. And the reason why you allow that myth to spread is to discourage or dissuade Black people from reading Marxism. And why would you not want Black people to study Marxism? Because again, the goal is to get us away from pursuing those political goals that I was talking about, right? Um, and something else on this notion or this decolonial wave in academia. I dislike the decolonial wave in academia. I dislike people calling themselves decolonial scholars and all of these things because what we have seen is that a lot of this decolonial work actually limits the bounds of colonial struggle by overemphasizing and putting bans over violence. So now you have decolonial scholars who are not advocating for decolonization, but they're instead arguing about why people might engage in violence, but why violence should not be pursued at all when we're talking about violent colonial systems and structures. And this is also why you have so many decolonial scholars that are currently silent as a genocide is ongoing. What it is an academic co-optation of the term so that the radicalism is lost. Instead, during Rodney's time, people talked about anti-colonial struggles. It was not that you had to peaceably resist and all. No, it was that you needed to overthrow people. And sometimes that requires violence, precisely because they are violent towards you. And what a lot of the decolonization narratives are saying is that we're going to document all that's wrong and all that's going on, how people are oppressed, but we don't actually want to give any real solutions to this. And I think that that presents us with a fundamental problem because now you are wanting people that are colonized to partake in a respectability politics. And once you push the conversation into respectability, that is why we see this wave of people coming up again, making the case for colonialism and still being treated as serious scholars. Because now you make the colonial fight as something that could be meshed with respectability, which doesn't make any sense. Um, and something else is that you have people who want to misattribute decolonization itself then to the revolution to then say that it fails. And again, it falls in line with this sort of condemning of violence. But you always have the rebellion or the struggle. And the rebellion or struggle is what is happening before you reach the sort of revolutionary moment. And if you never reach the revolutionary moment, what you're talking about is a counter-revolutionary moment. They also blur the distinction between those terms to say, oh, revolutions have failed, so people don't need to engage in revolutions. And it's no, revolutions have not failed. Struggles, specific struggles in specific locations have failed. The revolution is when the situation is changed, and the revolutionary moment or environment is how we are envisioning or putting into practice our visions, goals, ideas for what we want our future societies to look like. But when you also blur those distinctions, then you can have people saying, oh, revolutions failed, to dissuade and discourage people from even trying to engage in struggle that can reach, revolutionary potential. And so these are all just qualifying terms that serve the same purposes to me to dissuade revolution, to dissuade people from engaging in revolutionary text and all of these things. And so, yeah, I hate it a lot.
I'm gonna start moving us toward a close, y'all. Thank you for joining us, and for those of y'all who can stick around, we'll have these closing church announcements and get you home in the next 5 minutes or so.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I just want to first thank Tamanisha and Musa. Put a 9 in the chat. Show them some love in the chat. Um, yeah, something that Black men build. We're very clear about is the importance and the value of study. Um, that it does take a ton of work, a ton of hours to spend time with not just ourselves, but with each other. And we know, right, it's not just reading a text and shooting the shit with the homies. It's way beyond that. And so I just give them, yeah, just show them some love as again examples of deep, rigorous study, but also and I, an additional love, right, for both of them as folks who are intellectual, who for Tamanisha is an academic, but embodying, right, the way to be a academic, which is the way of Walter Rodney, and many others. But your display of that today, I think it's important for our folks to see, right? And so, yeah, I just want to thank y'all, right, for what y'all taught us, right? A lot about grounding, the method of grounding, the importance of study, right? And again, not solely through books or texts. And y'all's continued emphasis on the importance of building culture through struggle. We appreciate what you offered us today. Um, so, yeah, we close. I just want to ask everyone, yeah, if you're not in the struggle or the fight, right, like get involved, right? The time is always now, right? The time is always now for liberation. And so that requires our continuous engagement, the ebbs and flows, the momentum of it all. But we must make a choice. And if you haven't made a choice yet, I want to highlight a few ways to engage, or for many of you to continue to engage. And so the first way, we want to show some love for our comrade Musa, to help pay legal fees after being detained, coming back into this country from a trip from Cuba. And yeah, right. Like this could easily not be a conversation we having with our comrade right now. And so I just want to thank the creator, our ancestors, that we could have this conversation and y'all could learn from them, and for them to be sitting at home and to be with their people. We cannot be more grateful for that. We should all be grateful for that because in any given moment, right, we may be taken, we may be lost, we may be detained. Um, So hit that QR code. Let's, the goal. Let's just finish this. Let's get that goal and beyond right now, um, for our comrade. So hit that QR code, and yeah, let's toss
Absolutely.
these numbers.
Yeah, please, if you don't get the QR code, bit.ly/MusaBNB, we'll be reposting their campaign. And again, this study is paired with action. And what other action can we take than protecting our people when they do the work? So
Indeed.
this is not far for us to reach. Please share it. I'll drop the link in the chat. If it's not already, it's already in there. Comrades got us.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Um, Next, right? Donate to our organization. Yeah. If you don't know about the nonprofit industrial complex, it has a vice grip on our struggle. It has for decades. And so one of our strategies, like many others, right, is for folks to have unsolicited donations. And so it helps us build our work. It helps us to pay our brothers and sisters that do the work. It helps to build our national team, our field team, and our distribution of our wartime. And so support our organization, support all of our partners as well, if you know who they are. But today, right, go ahead and donate. Next, become a member, right? If you are ready to again, one of the most important things in any revolutionary will tell you this, right? One of the most important decisions you can make is join an organization. Um, for many reasons, but really I mean, for going to Tamanisha's point about grounding with others, like the organization is can be that central place for you, can be your political home. So join Black Men Build, right? um, to continue to do the work that's necessary to live in the values, right, of Walter Rodney and many other revolutionaries that we lost, right? Um, so hit that link. And if you are real quick before you go, we can go back real quick. We in multiple cities, and so check our website to see where we at, and yeah, reach out to an organizer to get a one-to-one, right? So if you want to learn more about becoming a member and doing the work, which is hyper localized right now, go ahead and do that as well. Okay. And then lastly, well, two things, you know what I'm saying? Spread your dollars today. Uh, Donate to Walter Rodney Foundation as well, right? Musa and Tamanisha both represent the foundation. And we sitting here learning and talking about Walter Rodney. Let's continue his legacy by making sure that is financially stable and has what they need. And then lastly, the National Black Radical Organizing Conference is in the second year, second iteration. We'll be joining you. If you join, right, you'll be with us. You'll be with Black Alliance for Peace, Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, Community Movement Builders, and other revolutionary formations for 3 days of grounding, right? 3 days of discussion, 3 days of strategizing, 3 days of action, 3 days of connection, 3 days of art and culture. So come fucking build with us. Um, you won't have, there's not many opportunities to do so. And the registration is only $25. So let's get it popping. Let's do this. Let's build. The time is now.
he went to bed, we
You say
adults.
what? I just got to emphasize how important it is to be here. But other than that, much love to y'all. I hope y'all have a good night. Thank y'all for rocking with us and staying with us this late. Until next time,
Peace to the nines, y'all.
peace to the nines.